This morning we're going to pick back up in the book of Proverbs, and we're going to be talking about instructions for children and sons as he's beginning here. Previously, and it has been a little while since we've been into the book of Proverbs, but previously we were looking at the author, and of course it specifically states it in verse 1 that it is Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. He's the author of Proverbs. The purpose for the Proverbs is to know wisdom and discipline, to comprehend the sayings of understandings, to give craftiness to the simple, to give purpose to the young men. So that is the intent of Solomon actually writing Proverbs. So we get a lot of good information about properly applying wisdom. Now, this is from an Old Testament perspective, so we do need to be cautious with that. But there's still a lot of universal truth in what he actually teaches here. So we'll be looking at that. Now, as we get down into verse 8, that's where we had stopped last time. So we're picked back up in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. It says, "My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother." Hear the instructions of your father here. Instruction actually means discipline in the sense of trade. It's the information your father has on how to do things properly. That's what it's talking about here when it's referring to instructions. So his trade, what he knows, pay attention, hear, and listen to them. We see an example of this over in Deuteronomy, where you have, again, they're told as far as instructions go, and listening to instructions. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 2, we see this. So in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 2, it says, "Know today that I do not speak with your children who have not known and who have not seen the..." Now, our translation here, I've got the New King James up, says chastening of the Lord, but that word chastening is actually a word instructions. So it's the instructions of the Lord. It's how to do things right. Okay. We do see discipline also being used, or instruction really, again in Isaiah. Now, this is over in Isaiah chapter 53 where we see this, and this is with Christ. So Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 5, it talks about here, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, and he was bruised for our perversities." The chastisement, and that word chastisement there is, again, instructions, discipline. So that's what it's talking about here over in Proverbs. So this is the chastisement of our peace, how to bring about peace. This is what he was actually showed. This is why Christ had to die on the cross and why he had to be resurrected. He had to die in order to pay for sins. There was no other way. That's the only way peace could come. But because he was a righteous man, he cannot remain dead, because death is a result of sin, physical death. He did not sin, but he was in a physical body that could die. It was subject to physical death, not because Adam sinned. It wasn't under the condemnation of. So they put a righteous man to death, and God responded by raising him from the dead. And it was a result of that we actually have peace with God. So this chastisement of our peace is literally talking about the trade or instructions on how to bring about our peace. That's what he was actually taught. Now back over in Proverbs again, back over in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. It goes on, of course, "My son, hear the instructions of your father," and that's what it's referring to. This now discipline, like I said, is not necessarily correction.
When you say peace, we're referring to peace between man and God, right?
Yes, that would be a peace between man and God. Yeah, which is a good point. How to bring peace between man and God. That's what Isaiah is referring to. So, and then in verse 8, he goes on, so my son, hear the instructions of your father, the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. And now this would be the rules that your mother has taught you to follow. Okay, she gives instructions, and we are to pay attention to those. And this concept of forsake literally means don't leave them behind. Don't forget what your mother has actually taught you, especially in doing things in a proper way. In verse 80 then goes on, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head. And your word graceful here, it's not really a good word to use in the Old Testament, the grace that is, because there is a distinction between grace in the Old Testament and grace in the New Testament. Grace in the Old Testament, predominantly, our English word favor would do a much better job of conveying what it's actually meaning. Okay, so we would typically translate it as favor, for they will be a favorable ornament on your head. This concept, of course, has a lot to do with things that were put on people, especially the culture and stuff like that, to show that they had favor. Chains and jewelry and other stuff like that. We even see that being used on animals, showing that they're favored animals. That's kind of what it's talking about here. So not the same concept as the grace we have, because remember in First John, or well, in John chapter 1, I should say, it specifically states that when Christ came, he brought grace and truth. This would be the grace that we now know today. So it's a little bit different than what he's talking about here. He then gets into instructions, and this is in verse 10. He says, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. So don't heed to the sinners who are actually enticing you. One who is known as a sinner, that's kind of the concept here when he says sinners, because he is saying those who are known to be ones who sin. An example of this is over in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 13, where here it's describing Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked, were very much wicked and sinful against the Lord. And this sinful here would be kind of expressing sinful ones. So you see a wickedness here and sinfulness, which is interesting to understand because it does show you that not all wickedness is sin. But as First John chapter 5 talks about sin and unrighteousness. All sin has a quality of unrighteousness because unrighteousness is the bigger term. The unrighteousness covers not only your actual acts, but also the processes within your mind. So wickedness here in the Old Testament isn't restricted to just your actions. It's also talking about the process of the mind. Because you can clearly see we have it distinguished from ones who are sinful. So there is now this doesn't, by the way, this doesn't change the definition of sin. First John, and we'll jump over there. First John chapter 3 and verse 4 gives us the definition of sin. And this is very important for us to understand, because there's so many people who want to come in and define sin in a certain way to justify implying that somebody is sinning when in all actuality, they're not sinning. A good example of this is to say that you can sin in your mind. Well, Scripture never says you can sin in your mind. What is going on in your mind is completely different from sin. And when you begin to understand that, you can overcome it, especially as a Christian, because we have the means to it. So here in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, whoever commits, or this word commits literally means the one doing. So whoever is doing the sin also is doing the lawlessness. And the sin is the lawlessness. Now, lawlessness is one who does not abide by the standard in which they have. It's not talking about the Mosaic law here. We as Christians are not under the Mosaic law. We do not have a do not law, but we still have a standard by which we live. And when we refuse to live by that standard, what we're doing can result in sin. As a matter of fact, for a Christian, sin is anything not done out from faith. So you can't actually look at the Mosaic law and say, well, as long as I'm doing all of this, I'm not sinning. Because the moment you begin to govern your life by the Mosaic law, what are you doing?
It's not out from faith.
You are actually sinning because it is not out from faith. The law is not out from faith. That's not the way it works. And that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about lawlessness. We do have a standard. It's who we are in Christ. That is the definition of sin. That will always remain the definition of sin. They will never change. Even in the millennial kingdom, when they are held liable for their trespasses, that's within the mind that is different from sin. The definition of sin doesn't change. The liability changes. That is, God is actually holding them accountable for that, where God is not holding us accountable today for our trespasses. And there's a good justifiable reason for that. A righteous reason, I should say, for that. When you understand in the millennial kingdom, they will have an environment where the earth is no longer cursed. So they're not going to have to work by the sweat of their brows to actually earn their food like we do today. The world system is going to be completely destroyed. The structure, the governmental structure in the millennial kingdom will be a righteous structure. You're not going to have government officials coming and stealing and manipulating and lying and all of the stuff that they do today. Won't be around. And then Satan, one of the worst enemies we have as far as independence from God, he is going to be bound. Now, if Satan's bound, that means all of his angels are bound with him. So they have a different environment. On top of that, every Jew will be born with the law of God actually on his heart, which means they don't need to be taught the law of God. They will know the law of God. So the standard is different. Now, if we knew the law of God from birth, our standard would be different, but we don't. We're taught it.
So what about the Gentiles? They don't have that on their heart.
The Gentiles do not have that on their heart, but they do have the Jews as an example. And they will seek out the Jews in understanding. So, but they will still be held liable. Yeah, because they're still in an environment where sin is not the norm anymore. As a matter of fact, righteousness settles down. It doesn't specifically, I should say, settle down. It actually rules. That's a better way of expressing that. Because once righteousness settles down and feels at ease, we're in the new heavens and the new earth where there is no wickedness. Wickedness is gone. Okay. But during the millennial kingdom, we will actually have a righteous environment where, again, the predominant focus of things will be doing right. So even the Gentiles who do not have the law of God written on their hearts will actually, from birth, that is, they'll have to go to the Jews to learn it. So it's not that they can't learn it, they just have to go to the Jews to learn it. They will actually still be held liable because they're still in a very good condition. The area that they're in, the environment that they're in, that's what I'm trying to say. So sin doesn't change. We don't want to change the definition of sin. So even back over in Proverbs 1, when he's talking about those who are sinners, he's talking about those who their actions are contrary to the standard by which they live. Now, when Solomon is writing this, the Jews have a standard, the Mosaic law. But if you go back to even prior to the Mosaic law, you'd have to go back to there to really understand the concept that you see here with Sodom and Gomorrah. Why is Sodom and Gomorrah being held liable for being exceedingly wicked and sinful? Over in Genesis chapter 13, verse 13. Because when Adam sinned, his warped nature also received the knowledge of good and evil, which means we are born with a conscience. We know when we're doing wrong. We're fully aware of that now. So even today, we are held liable. God is just not, he's not choosing to hold our trespasses against us at this point, but our sins still actually end with the same results. That would be death. Because we're in Adam. So as he goes on, son, my son, if sinners entice you, these people who are known to be sinners, don't follow them. They do not consent. Entice is used of a person who manipulates another person. So it's one who's manipulating people. A man enticing a woman to lay with him. That would be kind of the example here. This is over in Exodus. We see this in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 15. Well, it's probably 16, depending on what version you have. But here in 16, it says, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bribe or the bride price for her to be his wife. So if you go around thinking, now again, this is under the Mosaic law, if you go around thinking that you're going to take advantage of a young girl who doesn't know any better, and it's found out that you took advantage of her, you are liable and you are required to pay the what would be the dowry and take her as your wife. So this is not something that is, now he's enticing her, which of course would be to manipulate her. Other gods, when it comes to Israel, entice them. We see this over in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 16. Take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be deceived. That is enticed. Same word there. And you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Don't be enticed by what other gods or supposed other gods are offering you. Unfortunately, Israel was oftentimes enticed into that. This is still, by the way, a good warning for us as Christians. Do not be enticed by false gods, by false teaching, because it leads down a very bad path. The same type of path that it led the Israelites down when they went into idolatry. We see Samson's wife enticing him to tell her the answer to a riddle. Now, of course, the answer to the riddle, this is in Judges chapter 14, is how does he get his strength? And he gave a riddle that they couldn't possibly answer. There was no way that they could answer it. And it came to pass on the seventh day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with you with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? Then, of course, Samson's wife wept. And she manipulates the situation. It's pretty obvious that Samson knows, because nobody else would have known the answer to the riddle and what he said. So he that causes a major problem. Unfortunately, not enough of one, because she then ultimately manipulates him into telling that if he cuts his hair, he'll actually lose his strength. That is, the Lord will depart from him. And the reason is because he was set apart as a Nazirite. So as a Nazirite, he was not permitted to cut his hair. That's a vow. That's a Nazirite vow. And when he did, he was then no longer set apart to God until it grew back. And of course, we know that story. It grew back and he cried out to God, and God restored the strength to him, and he destroyed the Philistines. He destroyed them all. So we have this enticing concept. Enticing, of course, is still used today. As a matter of fact, this concept of enticing is what false teachers use to attract people. It's got to be enticing. Otherwise, they're not going to follow after people. We see an example of this concept of enticing over in 2 Peter. So over in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14. Now, in the context here, it is talking about false teachers. I think we'll have to kind of back up a little bit to get the false teachers, because you're going all the way back up into verse 1, where he says, "But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you." So there's going to be false teachers among you. And then he goes in and he's describing these false teachers as we go through here. And we get down to verse 14. That's where we see them enticing people. So in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. These are false teachers. Well, that is actually a good question. Enticing is a completely different, it actually is a completely different word. And, you are going to have in temptation, you're going to have enticement. But temptation, the intent is to get you to do something that's wrong. Where enticing is really to arouse your interest in something. So you're trying to attract a person, not necessarily get them to do something that's wrong. Although in the context, it could be the intent is there to do something wrong. Correct. In the word itself, enticing somebody or something being enticing isn't inherently wicked. Where like tempting is specifically getting them to do something that is wrong. Where here you're trying to entice them to follow after you. And then in the context here, they're going to get them involved in some pretty bad practices, but at first they're going to try to attract them to follow. Yeah, they are close, but I would say that the intent is a little bit different. Because a temptation, the intent is to get you to fail. Where enticing is to get you to follow after another person. That would be the focus there. And it's just like over in Proverbs where he's saying, don't follow after these sinners who entice you. Well, how are they going to entice you? Well, look at how wealthy we are. Look at what we have, the fun that we have, They're using those kinds of things, not necessarily saying, hey, come with us. Now, over in Proverbs, he will get to that, by the way, but a little bit later. And what I mean by that is actually getting involved in their wickedness. So they're going to start with enticing you, and then they're going to want you to get involved with their wickedness. That's so slightly different concept. Dropping down in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18, we also see the same word being used, where they use great swelling words of emptiness. They entice through the strong desires of the flesh, through lewdness. Now, lewdness would be licentiousness. It's living a lifestyle where you lack, well, you just act like, you have no restrictions in your lifestyle. That's what it's talking about here. The ones who actually escaped from this, who live in error while they're promising them liberty, they themselves are slaves to corruption. It's continuing on with talking about these false teachers. False teachers that plague the church today. So we got to be cautious with that. And, false teachers, by the way, are typically not the kind of people who present themselves in a negative way. They try to present themselves in a positive way. They entice. So you're typically going to see the pastor who is dressed well, who acts in a proper way. He's not necessarily going to be the one, and it's not restricted, but I mean, you'll see that typically they want to present themselves as a person that's worthy of following. So depending on the crowd, yeah, you might have a pastor come out in flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt, or others in a suit. Okay. What they wear doesn't necessarily change what they're trying to do. They're speaking false things. So back over in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 10, he says, you are not to go willingly. Okay. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Now, this concept of consent is about as close as we get in the Hebrew to the concept in the Greek of being desirously will. Don't desirously will to go with them. It's very similar in concept to that particular concept in the original. So we don't want to desirously will to follow after or be enticed by these sinners. We see an example of this word being consent or desirous will here. An example of this is over in Exodus. Let me get this word up. Exodus chapter 10 and verse 27, we see that Pharaoh, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Well, the would there is the same translation as consent. He didn't desirously will to let them go. Okay. So it does have that kind of desirous or willingness to do something. We see this with Israel also over in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 26, where it says, nevertheless, you would not go up. That is, you desirously willed not to go up, but rebelled against the commandments of the Lord your God. So they didn't want to go up. They did not desirously will to do that. Other nations seeking to entice Israel to worship their gods. We see this over in Deuteronomy chapter 13. Deuteronomy chapter 13 and verse 8 is where we see this. And you shall not consent to him or listen to him. So again, consent isn't necessarily a bad concept. It's just understanding what its meaning behind that is you do not have the desire to follow. Don't desirously will to actually follow these people. And these are the ones who are coming in and they're bringing in false gods. He says, do not consent, do not listen to them, nor shall your eye have pity on him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him. You're not to protect those who come in. Israel is instructed they are not to protect those who come in with false gods. They're not to have anything to do with them. They're to be very cautious about that. So back over in Proverbs, when he's talking about that, when Solomon is talking about that, this is something that Israel does have to deal with at this time. And he's saying, don't consent to these people. Don't consent to the wicked ones, the sinners, those who are known to be sinners. They entice you to take advantage of those who are weak. And this is back over in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 11 where we see this. And if they say, come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood, let us lurk secretly in the innocent, for the innocent without cause. So they're going to entice you to take advantage of those who are weak. Because we take advantage of the weak and look at how well off we are. They're criminals. They set an ambush for the blood of others, to shed blood. This is taking an opportunity to, and this isn't necessarily killing a person, but it is causing harm to a person. And of course, killing is not outside the concept of shedding blood either. So they are there to take what a person, well, an innocent person, somebody who's not paying attention to them. Innocent is really one who is blameless. They haven't done anything against them. That's what your concept of innocent means here. They hide for the innocent without cause. Hiding is actually hiding literally means to treasure up. So it'll say here, let us lurk secretly. Lurking secretly is hiding. We're hiding for the ones that we're going to actually ambush. Like I said, hiding literally is a word that means to treasure up. Looking for an opportunity to take advantage of somebody. And that's what they're actually doing. It's a type of evil that lies in wait. It is a violence of opportunity, not necessarily a physical violence, but this would be the violence that relates to opportunity. We see that, yeah, I do believe this is your lurking term here. Over in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11, where God is talking about, or here actually Moses is writing about the condition of humans or humanity prior to the flood. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Now, this concept of violence being filled with violence here is not necessarily a type of violence where everybody's going around killing each other. This is a type of violence where people will take advantage of each other. They will not help each other. Actually, I was doing another study on a word that related to relent, which oftentimes is translated as remorse. I did that on one of the little word studies. I think that was might have been this week's word study on relent. And it's interesting how with Noah's parents, they actually named him Noah because his name means to relent or to bring comfort, because they needed additional help to farm the land to help with all the work that they had to do. It's very interesting in this. When you put that together, that means the environment that they were in, even though they had plenty of relatives around them, they didn't have anybody to help them. Nobody was interested in helping them. They're only interested in their own things. That's what it's talking about with violence. Now if they had, for some reason, weren't able to tend to their whether it's flocks or their gardens or something like that, other people would take advantage of that and take it. This is the type of wickedness or evil that it's talking about here. So evil lies in wait. As I said, it's not necessarily a striking or killing violence, but it's taking advantage of people also. So it's more than just that. One who is a violent witness. Now, a violent witness, of course, is not somebody who's literally killing a person, but what they're saying is intended to be against that person and cause them problems. So this is over at Exodus chapter 23 and verse 1. You shall not circumlate a false report. Do not put your hands with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Don't be one who is actually lying in wait, hiding, treasuring up to present a false report to somebody. Now, again, this isn't necessarily that the person is doing violence as in a physical sense of violence, but they are actually trying to get violence done to that person, something done in that sense. And as I was saying, the concept of the Genesis, over in Genesis, the concept of innocence, we see this. This is over in Genesis chapter 44 and verse 10. This is somebody who has not done anything against you. These are the kinds of people they wait for. Genesis chapter 44 and verse 10, it says, and he said, now also let it be according to your word. He with whom it is found shall be my slave, and you shall be blameless. You shall be, now your word blameless here is actually your word innocent. Okay. There's nothing that you did that I'm not going to hold you accountable. You haven't done anything against me. So that's what it's talking about back over there in Proverbs, the one who is innocent in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 14, I do believe is where we were at. No, actually, we're a little bit before that. In verse 10 is where we're at. Then as we kind of move down, he says, these are the ones who will actually quickly put people to death if the opportunity arises. So we do definitely see death involved in this. Verse 12, let us swallow them alive like Sheol. Now, of course, Sheol is where people actually went who died. So there was no issue with taking their life, and whole like those who go down to the pit. And of course, that would be into the grave where they're talking about that. And then in verse 13, it says, we shall find all kinds of precious possessions. This is why they're lying in wait for them. They're there to steal their possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil, not have to do hard labor, take the labor from other people, steal from them. Verse 14 goes on and says, cast in your lot among us, let us all have one purse. So it's bringing a person in and allowing them to partake in the spoils of what they're doing. This is a way to entice people. This is oftentimes a way where criminals will entice people. They'll bring new people in and they'll treat them like family. You know, they're well taken care of. They're enticed to come and join us. Now, of course, their intent is very deceptive, but that's what their actual enticement is. You are not to walk in their path. In verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. We are not to share anything in common with the unfruitful works of darkness. This is for Christians. And you see this concept as he's saying here in Proverbs, do not walk with them. It's also reiterated for Christians. Over in Ephesians, we see this. In Ephesians chapter, where'd my note go there? Yeah, Ephesians 5:11. Over in Ephesians 5:11, it says, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Now he's talking about us as Christians. Okay. Back up a little bit. He says, for you once, in verse 8, for you once were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord, what is pleasing. Putting to the test. We put to the test because we understand God's desires will for our lives and having no fellowship. This is together being associated with. No fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Not as Christians, we're not to be involved with that. I mean, the reality when we understand this, and Paul addresses this with to the Corinthian saints. What fellowship does righteousness have with unrighteousness? They're completely contrary to each other. We see this over in 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. Here it says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? One who is not going to live by a standard. They are not righteous ones. There's no fellowship. Or what communion does light, what part, what share does light have with darkness? That's an interesting concept, and it's so good to really understand because even a small amount of light in darkness completely pierces the darkness. Darkness cannot overcome light, which is quite interesting. They have nothing in common with each other. Where there is light, there is not darkness. Where there is darkness, there is not light. The two cannot be together at the same time. They can't occupy the same space. Their path is going to run to evil, back over in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 16. He says, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. So they have no issue, again, with taking people's lives. When people like this, entice the Christian to be involved with them, we should be responding in a righteous manner. Okay? We are to overcome wrong with doing things that are beneficial. We're not to be involved with people who take advantage of others. We see an example of this over in Romans chapter 12 and verse 21. It talks about this, among other places, but here in Romans chapter 12 and verse 21, it says, and do not be overcome by wrong. Now, this word evil here is actually your word wrong, doing things that lack in character. Okay? Don't be the one who's doing things that you know are wrong just because you think you can get away with them because nobody's looking. That's the kind of evil it's talking about here. But overcome or be victorious over what is wrong with what is good. Now, here it uses a different word, not necessarily proper, which is typically the opposite of your word wrong here. It actually uses what's beneficial. So we overcome the things that are lacking in character by doing that which is beneficial. We as Christians have that ability to actually do that now. Do not repay wrong for wrong, but regard that which is proper. Now, this we back up a little bit in the same chapter. So we're in Romans chapter 12 and back up to verse 17 is where he says this. Repay no one evil for evil. Now, both of your words evil here are your word for wrong. So do not repay somebody who wronged you by wronging them. Having a regard for good things. Now, your word good things here is your preference or your regard is to doing things proper, even if nobody else is doing things that are proper. Even if if they're doing things that are improper to you, you don't respond in kind. You do it the right way in the sight of all men. That's in contrast to following after the paths of these who want to go down in wickedness and evil and want to entice you to go along with them. Back over in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 17, he then goes on and he says, surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. Which makes sense. I mean, you'd think, if you're going to set a trap, you don't set the trap in the sight of the person you're trying to trap. It's in secret. And that's what they actually do. This is interesting here. They vainly set up traps in the sight of those who seek that they actually seek to snare. They vainly do that. The sin nature kind of does the same thing to us. If we're not paying attention, sin nature has no problem actually setting a trap for us that we should be it should be obvious, but oftentimes we'll follow anyway. An example of this we see over in, let's see, where was I at here? James chapter 1 and verse 14, where it's talking about the process of how a sin comes about. And it says, but each one is tempted. Now, this word tempting here is a solicitation to do something that lacks in character. So this is you're being tempted to do a sin. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. Our sin nature uses our own desires against us to get what it desires. So it's going to entice. There's going to be an enticement of our sin nature, of our flesh, from the desires that we actually have to get us to sin. An ensnared Christian will actually do the desires will of Satan. That's kind of a scary thing when you think about it. 2 Timothy talks about this. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 26. And that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. Well, how do I know if I've been taken captive by Satan to do his desirous will? One of the areas you could quickly identify this is in what you are speaking of, what you are talking about, what you're teaching, what your primary push is it causing divisions among the saints? Now, I'm not talking about separating out those who are speaking false things. I'm talking about divisions. A good example of this, by the way, I was just talking about this before we started, is the King James only camp, where they want to say that the King James Bible is the inspired word of God. Okay, fine. You want to actually believe that that's the inspired word of God. It is not. It's going to cause you some problems, but it's not worth dividing. Why is it not worth dividing? Because predominantly the King James Bible does a very good job of expressing the original language. There's a few areas it falls short on. There's some it completely fumbles, but for the majority of it, it's actually not a bad translation. Okay? But they will call a person who uses another translation a heretic, divide from them, separate from them. Somebody who references the Hebrew and the Greek, oh, you stay away from that person. That's causing divisions in the church. That's Satan. That's being snared by Satan to do his desirous will. If you're producing any of the works of the flesh, because Satan will use your flesh. Not to mention, you also need to understand how to properly defend yourself against Satan. You know, those who determine that they're going to be wealthy in this life are going to bring themselves into a whole lot of different snares. 1 Timothy talks about this. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9. But those who desire, this is actually not your word desire, this is your word determine. It's a little stronger than desire. Those who desire, that is determined to be rich, fall into temptations and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful, strong desires, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Corruption. This is what happens. You determine to be wealthy, and all of a sudden, these sinners who are enticing you, because they're enticing you with wealth, you're going to go down their path. And we can see, even in Solomon's time, he's like, don't follow those kinds of people. That path is not a good path. They lie in wait for blood. The righteous will actually see them fall. He's going to go on and talk about that. And then he's also going to talk about how their greed, how it's going to end up. Because he then begins to, in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 20, talk about the impact of rejecting wisdom, which is